Good evening. It's good to see so many people here, which probably speak volumes of our guest. I usually try, when we have figures of the caliber of Daniel Libeskind, to do like a brief introduction and let them do the talk. I suffer from the same illness that most Dean offers of ego and all that, but I try always to tone it down and don't make it about the introduction. I'll try my best again. There's a couple of things I want to point out which I think is important in the context, because it's something that it makes me happy and proud that Daniel Libeskind's lecture tonight is one of the lectures of our student selects. Every year a group of lectures in our calendar is selected by our students, and it's always great. What I'm saying is great is because I think it's interesting for me that the students want to listen a figure like Daniel. He is an artist, a theorist, a teacher, and an architect. And he has, for sure, one of the most unique and strange trajectories one can think of for an architect. The reason why is because I think, like many, not that many figures in our field, has many different periods and different trajectories that somehow they try to make sense. The reason also why I'm happy that Daniel Libeskind is here speaking, because he's a polemic figure. He's not a guy who walks through the middle, and that's something that we appreciate always. But the other thing which I find incredibly interesting to listen what he has to say is he's somebody who really has been in the darkest corners of discipline and knowledge, to the extraordinary work of Micromegas or Chamberworks or the early installations, to, of course, the breakthrough Jewish Museum. This was really incredibly sophisticated, in-depth for the discipline audience. But at the same time, he started to figure it out, him with Nina and the office that they set up, they started to figure it out how to transition in that, to bring some of those ideas to operate what we tend to call in academia the real world, which is a word that we hate, like the academic world is unreal. Well, that maybe is true, but there is something about that which I think is fascinating to see what is the relation of that, which I think always has been at the intersection of what I consider the ultimate struggle in any kind of architecture education, which is the relation between the discipline and the profession, and how we go back and forth between those territories. It goes without saying that his early work in Chamberworks and Micromega is already in part of the history, but I don't want to talk of Daniel Libeskind as an historical figure, because his work is very much here and now and happening now. But what I'm really interested to see is how the relation between those two worlds can start to operate and how that can be negotiated. And this is, I think, that's where I think the polemic lies, and I think the challenge lies. And as I said, he has been at the center of many polemics over his long career by now, and I think that is how the body of an architect should be. And I think if you're not pissing off half of the people, you're doing something wrong. So half of the people should agree with you, half of the people should disagree with you. One will wonder for such a success, right? But again, in the early, not the early work, but the transition work, like the Victoria Albert Museum, which I consider a highly influential project, Potsdamer Platz master plan, and of course, more recently, after the World Trade Center competition, and now the much bigger scale and large and small, but still, you guys still do a small budget project, which I think is very interesting to see. But most of it, what I found interesting is that, I don't know if this was by choice or because life happens, that there was a moment that the decision to don't remain only inside in this disciplinary discussion only. And of course, the discipline never goes away, but in that territory, in that struggle between the discipline and practice, I think that is where the work starts. So, in that light and that spirit, I think it's a great time to have Daniel Libeskind to lecture here on SCI-Arc. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here because SCI-Arc is really one of the great schools of architecture. It's always been. There are not too many great schools of architecture that follow really architecture design. They're not swayed by just the fashions of the moment. And I wanted to just share with you something similar to what you said, because I never had a goal. You know, most gurus tell you you should have a goal. and then try to get to your goal. I never had a goal in my life. Maybe I come from a kind of a Jewish Zen idea that follow the path. The path is vulnerable because you can be swayed to the left or to the right very easily. But if you stay on the path, you'll discover a world, well, I discovered a world that is kind of an amazing, a world that really opened up and continues to open up for me. And I start with this Between Zero and Infinity. It's my first book in the 70s. And I have to tell you the story because after I left school, I did some work. I didn't work for an architect. I didn't succeed to work for an architect for more than a day. I tried 2 or 3 offices, great offices, but I said, that's not for me. Continued to draw. So Toshio Nakamura, the head of the A+U, very famous person, invited me. He said, Mr. Libeskind, why don't you put some of your work, your project, we'll do an issue of work that is not built. But I didn't have any buildings. So I put all sorts of work, and I designed it, and I created with Lorraine Wild, the great designer. I sent it to Tokyo, was there for a couple of months, then came back, the same box came back with a letter saying, Dear Mr. Libeskind, we are, after all, an architectural publication. We cannot publish this work. This is not architecture. So I was kind of, a little downtrodden. I went to see my mentor and dean, John Haydock, great person. And he was just laughing hysterically. And he said, why don't you, without opening the box, just go to Rizzoli across the street, see Mr. Manicelli, and show him the work. And how lucky that Mr. Manicelli published this work. So that's a work that I started in school. It was collage. I started cutting up plans of architecture. I started building, volumes and three-dimensional projections of these plans. I was interested in other kind of materials that create dynamics of architecture. And then I started creating models, my own. I had no commissions, and I had no really taste to work for anyone. But I have to say, Nina is here. She's my wife, my partner now. I would have never been able to do, and that's a clue to do what I did, because she supported me for so many years, working as I was doing absolutely nothing. And so, I was able to build models that I was interested in, architectural models, exploring color, going on from kind of the education that I had, with John Haydock and Peter Eisenman and Richard Meyer and, all the great, theoreticians of that time and architects, to my own sense of how would architecture proceed into the future with me. And of course, I used any means that I could, collage, drawing, all you need is a desk. This was the time before computers. You couldn't really download materials or delete materials. You just had the materials you had, and you could work with them. And then I decided to do a series of drawings. I don't know where my idea came from, but it was kind of a mad idea because I tried to create explosions of a drawing that had neither 2 or 3-dimensional background to it. I called it Micromegas, and I really thought I was on the verge of discovering something that was really architecture and the city. Now, it's easy to say it in retrospect, but at that time, it was not considered architecture. Now I'm lucky that it's hanging in Museum of Modern Art. But at that time, it was just kind of a waste of time. But I thought, no, I'm doing architecture. This is really architecture. If you don't have a client, you don't have a social basis, you don't have a political program, you don't got to draw, fancy castles and theoretical schools. You're going to use drawing. And you develop drawing. And my second series of drawings was more, I think, even more complex, called Chamberworks, because I used to be a professional musician at one point of my life. So I tried to connect structures of architecture, structures of music, structures that explode or implode into different aspects of the world that I was interested in. And these were drawings, very calculated drawings. They were not emotional drawings. They were really, I was always admiring the great, Renaissance, Baroque architects who did the treatises. Palladio, if you read his treatise, he never succeeded to do a single building that looks like that, by the way, in the treatise. All the measurements are different in his buildings. But I said, I got to do my own theory, my own book of architecture. So, I worked with horizons, vertical and horizontal horizons, and I created a series of 28 drawings, which took me to still another place in the path. Then when I was a teacher, I was head of Cranbrook School of Architecture, I responded to a competition in Venice, the Venice Biennale, with my students. It was a competition to design Italian cities. But I thought, it's no use designing an Italian city. Create machines, like as Vitruvius recommended. If you're going to be an architect, first do some drawings, and then build yourself some machines. So I figured I'll build the reading machine. Of course, Romelli, the water wheels, the eternal circle of the same of Nietzsche. I produced those singular books that I printed also, which unfortunately disappeared. All of them disappeared. I built the memory machine, which was a kind of puppet theater. The first one was kind of medieval. No electricity was used in it. Really, it was an experiment in darkness with candlelight. Don't use any machine tools. This one was more like a puppet theater of the mind. That's the Renaissance. It's all pulleys and levers and tricks of, done for the king or for the emperor. So created this large-scale machine, which is called the memory machine, and it had, really a lot of elaborate things that I thought were crucial to design a city. And then the writing architecture machine, which was large-scale machine, had these cubes that were rotated individually in chaotic ways and could produce a city. I was lucky that I received the Lion of Venice, because it was a proposal of intersubjective architecture. Architects shouldn't be designing for themselves, by themselves, with all sorts of peoples, and accept the chaotic element that enters architecture where you have non-architects working in architecture. Then very recently, the Venice invited me to do. So I continued drawing, and that's, by the way, because I think that's the origin of, to me. It's not going with 2x4s to the forest, Logier, and trying to do the primitive hut. It's not the sukkah, it's not the Adam's house in paradise. It's an intellectual discipline. So I did these drawings, I call it Sonnets of Babylon, 101 drawings. They're different. I'm driven, and it was a connection between Shakespeare, because I love, and I've memorized many, many Shakespeare sonnets. And also Babylon, the idea of Iraq, Babylon, the Babylonian Talmud, what happens in the world, what new techniques are developing. And these drawings are always, a parallel to my work. I don't do them academically, but they are somehow part of how I, keep the momentum going. And Albert Einstein said something very, very intelligent. He said, life is like riding a bicycle. You got to move forward if you want to retain your balance. It's a smart thing for a great genius to say. It's such a simple thing. Just keep momentum. So when I was in Berlin, I participated in competitions. This was, seeing the city in three-dimensional fragments that come together in a very unexpected way, and Alexanderplatz competitions. And of course, my first competition that I won, I never entered a competition before this one. I won it, but then the wall came down, and I couldn't build this. Otherwise, maybe it would have been built. Berlin, 1987? Yes, something like that. And that was, in the Museum of Modern Art for the Deconstructivist exhibition. So this is the first project that I built. I never built, as you saw, I never built even a small project. I didn't know any architects where I grew up. I didn't know any doctors, lawyers, any professionals. I grew up in a working class neighborhood in the Bronx. I was an immigrant. So for me, architecture was something very, very different. Things that are in your mind. Voices. Why do I call it voices? Because I think architecture is based in many ways, not on things you see, but in the unheard voices, often voices that have been repressed in history, voices that whisper. They don't shout, they don't whisper somewhere from an edge or margin of space. And that is Berlin. And when I came there, when I won, well, at that time it was not called a Jewish museum, by the way. It was called Erweiterungsbau, the extension building to the Berlin Museum. But I did everything in my power to do something else, because my parents were Holocaust survivors. I grew up in Poland. I didn't go to the library or archives to study the Holocaust and the destruction of what happened from Germany, from Berlin, the eradication, the first real genocide, intellectual genocide, to decide to exterminate a people. Now we are more used to it, because it's as Derrida said, between genocide, Holocaust, and then Hiroshima, the bomb. The world has altered completely. We don't see a human soul in the same way. So I plotted the star across the city of Berlin, a star in which I connected Germans and Jews. I kind of intermarried them across a matrix. I started with, Friedrich Schleiermacher, the veil maker. That's what the name Schleiermacher means, a Protestant theologian. And I married him to Varnhagen, Rachel Varnhagen, the great woman, Jewish, tried to assimilate, did not succeed, who invented German literature. She had the salon of Goethe, Schiller, that she kind of invented the idea of German literature. How amazing. Paul Celan, Mies van der Rohe, and so on. And I created really a new ground for the building. So, of course, the ground is in Berlin, it's on Lindenstrasse, but that's my ground. It's the Gedenkbuch, it's the names. And of course, Jews who came to Berlin from Poland, from other places, took the name Berlin. I started with the name Berlin, but I couldn't really ramify it to the hundreds of thousands or the millions that theoretically it should be ramified. So there it is, the building. You see later on I did the court, the glass court. The building is a zigzagging structure showing the turmoil of history that changes directions as we speak. But there's one central straight line. It's a line of emptiness that runs through the building, and it's absent. It's really the total fatal destruction that will not leave us. It whispers to us through that void across the beautiful city of Berlin today. I was the only architect. There were 190 architects or something in the competition. You'd be interested. Every architect, and there were some good ones, put a bridge between the Baroque building and the new building. I decided that such a thing could not be done. You cannot put a bridge, a visible bridge, between the Baroque and the new building. You have to put the bridge in the depth of the underground. And that's what I proposed. As the entrance, you go through the Baroque building, which before being a museum was the courthouse of Berlin, done by a very famous architect. And then you go to the underground, which is a kind of trilogy. You have three kind of ascending plate going to three different places. And then on the left, you see the city lodge. That's where I come from. It's deportation of the state, the deportation of the city. It's what Carl Schmitt, the Nazi philosopher, called the emergency situation. So that's how you enter, into the underground. And by the way, that's not just metaphorical, because in 1933, stones from Jewish cemeteries were used to construct the subways of Berlin. And at the height of the Enlightenment, there was darkness. At the height of Hegel and Lessing and Kierkegaard in Berlin, there was prejudice, bigotry, and so on. So yes, that's the entrance. And then one of the routes leads you to a dead end. And I call it the Holocaust Tower. And by the way, for the longest time, it's interesting from an architecture point of view, I had no light in it. The building was already under construction. I said, there's no light. There's no necessity to put any light into such a structure because it's a dead end. It's a total darkness. There's no. Then I, by accident, read a story of a survivor. She was in Brooklyn now, and she was many years later saying that when she was locked into the cattle cars to go to the Stutthof concentration camp, she said she saw a line of light. And then she reflected. She said, I don't know where that line came from. Maybe it was just a crack in the car. Maybe I saw a plume of an airplane, a white plume of an airplane smoke. But it didn't matter to me because I survived. I believe I survived because I held on to that line of light. So at the end, I put the line of light really very much at the top, a kind of homage to the fact that without hope, you cannot really build anything. Nothing, it's not worth building anything if there's no hope. And then, of course, there's the garden. You saw it, it's a little bit like my writing machine. It's 49 columns, 7 times 7. The central column is filled with the earth of Israel, and the 48 with the earth of Berlin, 1948, the foundation of the state of Israel. It's a tilted garden, call it Garden of Exile, because Berlin is also exiled from itself. Berlin is in, it's in LA, it's in New York, it's in Sydney, it's in South Africa. It's not where you find Berlin today. So it's also a garden of exile, and there's vegetation, but it's high up inside of these columns, which feeds the water, and you have a view of a ship. You lose your orientation a bit. You get slightly nauseous. You don't know where you are. The building looks crooked on the outside of the street. And then the third road, the road to the continuity, across the void, across the dead end, across the exile, goes to the collections. And I want to show you this because the main stair does not end in a door. I didn't want to say that there is some redeeming feature here when you go to the there's no redemption. It's just a blankness that you just shift laterally to go into the connections, to the collections, and that's Berlin. I mean, there are no treasures here. It's fragments now of 2,000-year-old Jewish history in Berlin. It was started as a Berlin museum, but it's called 2,000 Years of Jewish History in Germany. And so the windows, they are not really windows. They are these cuts of that map, of that matrix that I showed you before. And then there is the memory void that runs throughout. You see the bridges connecting across. And here I want to say I used the para-architectural idea. It was my own musical idea. I wanted to complete an opera. It's a strange thing for an architect to do in a competition. But one of my favorite operas is called Moses and Aaron. I don't know whether you know it, by Schoenberg. First Arnold Schoenberg, then when he came to LA, Aaron Schoenberg. Exiled from Berlin, a Jew, 12-tone music. So he wrote Moses and Aaron, 2 acts in Berlin, fantastic. And then there's an aporia at the end of Act 2, and there's no music. Just Moses calls on to God. And there's nothing. There's no answer forthcoming. And the third act is unwritten. It's just empty. I saw the manuscript. So I said, I can complete it. He's right. You cannot complete it musically anymore, but you could complete it in the acoustical space, in the echoes of the footsteps of the visitors as they move through the space. And it is there. If you listen to it, you can see the answer to that Moses query in that great opera. And of course, the building is emblematic. It has many different devices which are used. I'm glad to say it's changed the city a lot. It took a long time to be built, not because it was a difficult building to build, but because of the politics. And I have to just make this clear, that this building would have never been built if not for Nina. Because she's got capacities that are, by the way, I would never be an architect if she did not join me. I kidnapped her. She had her own profession. And when we were in Berlin, I said to her, are you going to join me? And she said, but I've never been in an architect's office in my life. And I said, the same applies to me. So that's the building. And then I was able to build, in the beginning in the program, there was no need for dinners, for parties. But now it's grown. There's bar mitzvahs. The last time I was there was a dinner of politicians of Germany. So I was able to continue, and it's with the park, and even later on, just recently, in the Blumenhalle, which is across the street, historically protected building, old flower market, I was able to do the Jewish Museum Academy, where people can have data. There's a library, parts of the program which were never part of the original program, because originally said no more than 30,000 people come to the building a year. And then at some point, I had to take the whole air conditioning system out and replace it because the figures were, by many factors higher. But in this building, at the Academy, the museum allowed me to do something. I chose my favorite quote by Moses Maimonides. He was a Jewish philosopher, a great philosopher, about 1,000 years ago. And he said, hear the truth, whoever speaks it. I never forgot that. And I put it in the original language, which is Judeo-Arabic. He worked in Egypt, in Morocco. It's part of the Arab world. And the building is standing in a Turkish neighborhood. It's a Turkish, it's an immigrant from Syria and everywhere. So I thought that's good to put in Arabic, Hebrew, German, English. Hear the truth, whoever speaks it. It's a complex idea. If you speak it, you should hear the truth. And there it is, a building that took a long time, but really many chancellors of Germany told me that it had a bigger impact on how Germans see themselves. Because I didn't build this building for the Jews. I built it for people from that area, from Germany. It had a bigger impact than all the political statements, education programs, because a building can be important. It doesn't have to be big, but can tell a story. And this building has a narrative. Very recently, I completed, just a few weeks ago, a memorial to the Holocaust in Ottawa, in Canada. It's the only country, allied country, that does not have a memorial to the Holocaust. Every other country has. It's in Ottawa. It was opened by Trudeau, Prime Minister Trudeau. And again, I based it on that star, because that's how Jews were murdered. They were murdered with a star, even if they were not religious. But the star was deconstructed by the Germans into triangles. So I based it on triangles as well. Triangles were used in different colors to murder homosexuals, to murder Roma, political prisoners, people who are mentally or physically unwell. So they had a whole typology of triangle and then the double triangle. It's fascinating. This was an intellectual murder. It was not a... So I worked here, and you can see the large-scale murals by Ed Burtynsky, one of my favorite photographers. Okay? Large-scale murals, photographs today of the sites of murder. So they're not these, historical 1945 photographs. They're just nice paths in the forest, trees. And I did something else. I aligned at the center. There's a memorial flame. There's an eternal flame. There's many different triangular and complex spaces to meditate. There are benches to sit. It's in the middle of the city. But it's facing, you see the tower. It's called the Peace Tower, the tower of the House of Commons of Canada, Parliament. Because my idea was this. You ascend to another level. You look at the tower. The Holocaust did not start with just hooligans on the streets hitting people. It started with decisions of the government to deprive citizens of their human rights. It's the government. I thought, yes, when you talk about the Holocaust, and we're living in a world that is very vulnerable, as we all know, look at the government. And there it is. It's in the middle of a great city. It's dramatic. I used very, very simple means, just concrete. But it's a public space. It's a piazza. And I see people on bicycles, kids coming, families. It doesn't have any really texts on it. It's just a space. Okay. An architect cannot really be an architect without doing a home. But this was my first time I was able to do a home, because I started with big projects. Nobody ever asked me to do a home. But how lucky I was that a couple came to me and said, we'd like you to design a home. And they are really art experts, architecture experts. They have already great things in other cities. They said, we'd like to make a home that we don't have to put our art in. We want the home itself to inspire us. So there's the plan. It's a relatively small home. You can see in section. It's kind of complex because it sometimes detaches itself in section. And it's in a beautiful place. It's in Connecticut. It's on this green field. And it's a monocoque construction, stainless steel. It's hard to describe it because the colors change depending on how you approach the house. Sometimes I've seen it black. I've seen it light blue. I've seen it brown. It's this amazing material. Of course, the building has no columns. It's just a folded form that is also very functional. Not a lot of windows. No picture windows here, no big squares, nothing like that. Just like porches, light coming in the winter in the right angle. So I worked very closely. You have to work very closely with clients who are sophisticated and in this beautiful landscape. And also, they asked me to design everything, including their kitchen. I was really amazed. So they told me how they like to entertain, cook, how to do everything. That's a kind of Gesamtkunstwerk. Even the sofa, the carpets, the little tables, the bookcase, even the shower, and the bathtub. Now that was fantastic. I have to tell you, I don't like the English bathtubs with the curves. Really, they disturb me. This is the kind of the 19th century Victorian idea. So this is a very sharp bathtub. But it's not dangerous. It's not dangerous. And then I was even able to design the faucets, because I don't like those silver faucets of Arnie Jacobson. I like a faucet that will be like a straight line. You open it and then you close it and just a straight line. So it works. They were fantastic. And of course, the atmosphere of a house is so important. It's about love. It's about intimacy. It's about the bed. It's about what the building looks like at night. It's about home. So I was so lucky that I always say I made only one mistake in this house. Because once they gave us the keys to stay in the house for a weekend, Nina has never forgiven me. She's like, well, why don't we have a house like this? And she's right. Okay, because I'm also speaking to students, it's interesting to design a very regular project. Now, I've had a chance to design museums, big projects, city plans. What if you design just an apartment building on a corner block in a European city like Berlin? What would it look like? So here it is. Because Berlin is all, it's kind of formulaic ever since, 18th century. Every building is kind of typological. It's got the Schinkel room without much light in the corner, right? So I said, okay, I have a chance. I have a client, a regular corner lot, Chausseestrasse, very close to where the wall was, still part of the East. Let me try to design within the parameters of, apartments, something that looks different, that is interesting, that is innovative. And I developed, actually, maybe you don't see it here, a tile with an Italian company, Casa Grande, that is ecological. It's a terracotta tile, because I didn't want it like the metal building, the concrete. A warm terracotta tile with titanium that can transform the carbon dioxide into oxygen. It's actually very good, and it's three-dimensional. You can see it here in the sea of buildings, right? That corner, it should stand out as a courtyard. And the facade is not folded, just formally, but I want to create different units. There are many units, each one different. There are big units, small units. Try to use the possibility of the building lines backwards and forwards, still within the laws. Obviously, you cannot transcend the laws, and make an economical building that breaks the scale of that corner and gives an identity, gives a luminosity. You can see the tile here, I think, a little bit better. And the interior of the apartment are also, in front of you is this like the CIA headquarters of Germany. Very boring. It's like endless buildings for 6 blocks. But I want to make something that even makes the building look good, like in a George Grosz painting, right? You got kind of a little balcony, a little loggia, windows that travel around. So yeah, that's the challenge of creating a regular apartment building. And that's, it's a huge challenge because it's a formula. And even you can see the Schinkel corner, which is usually dark. I brought light through these triangular glazed windows. And I'm very happy because the building sold rapidly. That's very important when you work for a developer, that the building is a success, that the developer makes money quickly and rapidly, and he asks you then to do another project. City. Well, city, we know that the world is about cities. I had a chance to create a project in Singapore. Singapore is a great place. It's a city-state, very amazing place. Very poor. 7 years ago, 6 years ago, it was a poor place, poverty. But the head of this little state decided, let's plant trees. All streets should have trees. That was his first idea. The guy's a genius. If you have streets, with trees already, the city looks better than just a muddle of faceless buildings. Okay, I didn't build trees, but these buildings, double curved buildings, and also the buildings on the bottom, which look small, but they're pretty big actually. And this was really more about density. How do you create really high density by raising the height of the building, which is not allowed in Singapore? So I have to tell you the story. I created this double curved buildings. You see the towers, 6 of them, and they're connected with amenity bridges. And the developers, Keppel Bay, said, great, we won the competition, fantastic, great. Then after a while, they said, look, Mr. Libeskind, let's be honest, it's too expensive to do double curves. Let's just do 1 curve, it's enough. It'll look good, it'll look like a sail. So, as an architect, you have to just swallow hard and say, okay. We went back to the redevelopment agency of Singapore, and they said, to the developer, we gave you 50% more height because of the form of the building. Of course, the developer immediately brought back the 2nd curve. So here it is. It's a kind of ribbon of buildings on the canal. Even the lower buildings are pretty complex in order to take advantage of their position in this very, very high density environment and provide a sense of kind of almost the Baroque, that every window has a view. They're very dramatic. Actually, Ridley Scott is using it for a stage set for some futuristic film. But really, it's really a lively place with a lot of amenities for the boardwalk, clubhouses, places to be high scale, interesting architecturally, and because of the high density idea, the fact that I was able to raise the building 50% higher, I could really reduce the footprint of the whole project. And so the people have grass and green spaces, and I think that's the key. And I'm very proud of the fact that this project in a city that has Jean Nouvel and Foster and Zaha, and I mean everybody, every great architect that I admire is working there, was and remains the most profitable project in that city. So that's interesting because double curve people said, like, are you sure people want to live? Because there's nothing really below them and there's nothing exactly above them. But the people, the sense of space, the sense of, and then I received another project, very different. You can see reflections. This is corals, very different planning regulations. So I used another logic here because you couldn't make buildings this tall. My logic was make very dense building, but don't build anything in the front or build very low buildings in the front. So every building, even though they're very close to each other, gets a sense of space and a sense of amplitude, and they stand in water. I kind of made the illusion that all the buildings rise out of water. There's a lot of complexity in this, what appears to be simple elevation, but every one of them is strangely unique. And that's part of it, customize the building. It takes a lot of work. I now understand what Mies van der meant, because Mies van der said you should design only one building in your life and just repeat it. That's genius. That's a genius of the 1920s, right? Don't design two different buildings. Design one, good one, and build one in Toronto, build one in Chicago, build one, wherever. But, it's a different era. So you have to struggle harder to create uniqueness, to create. And I'm most proud that the head of the redevelopment agency, she is a fantastic planner, architect. She told me the story when this opened. She was sitting there in one of those units. She called her husband. She lives in a village. She said, let's move to a cool place. Let's move over here. So, okay, that's all important. War. We live. When I did the Imperial War Museum in Manchester, I remember the words of Winston Churchill, who's a very smart person, who said, there will never be a time without war. There will always be war. It's just, how do we handle these wars? How do we steer them to a better place? So I had a chance to compete in a competition which many people were perplexed. Why would I even compete for the largest building in Germany, largest museum, the National Military Museum of Germany in Dresden? And you may not know Dresden in this Bellotto painting, but it was considered the Venice of the North, the most beautiful city in Europe outside of Italy. When you go to the north, there's no other city, Dresden, with its artworks, amazing architecture, churches. It's a jewel. And of course, this picture, the complete devastation and the Allied bombings of 1945, where the city was just leveled, just nothing remained. So it's a beautiful photograph with this remaining angel there. But yeah, that the city was just tabula rasa. That's my building. It's the armory, which is a large-scale armory built in the 19th century, but quickly became the Kaiser's Museum, Saxon Museum, Nazi Museum, Soviet Museum, East German Museum, and then after unification, people said, what are we going to do with this building? So this was my idea. Place the building into a triangulated mode, which points at the first bomb that fell in 1945, and then be in the triangle that the pilots saw as they bombed the city. At the same time, give a view from that bombing position into the completely rebuilt city. So you're simultaneously in both pictures. You're in the pictures of the destruction of the city and a rebirth of the city. It's strange, but I always like generals and military, because once they make up their mind that that's the project they want, there was no way to dissuade them. And of course, other architects said, no, we were not allowed to build in front of the building because the historical facade. But I didn't do anything. I just cut it in two places, really. So here it is. Here it is in plan. You can see it's a very large, vast structure, which has so many exhibits. Now, it's exhibits from the Teutonic Knights, 12th century of German history. Can you imagine? And this is like West Point. This is where German officers go to learn about their military history. So it's a very important. And the arrow, or the vector, as I call it, incorporates the old stair. It's totally different structure. It's concrete. But it's off-center, exactly in the chronology between 1914 and 1945, which are the militaristic years of fascism, which brought the world so much suffering and so much death. So for the architects, you can see it's how do you weave this museum with its very, very strong message through the historical fabric and kind of create a contrast without any ambiguity of what you're doing in this building. Of course, it's not just a facade. It's like a system that moves right through the building and evacuates the old history towards that point of the bomb. And I renovated. It was very poorly treated under East German government. It was kind of falling apart. It was kind of kitschy restoration, but I really restored it to what the armory was. And this is the Napoleonic period where hundreds of thousands of people died. And then there's a cut. And that's that wedge. It just cuts. It's a different through all the columns. Why not? Cut through the columns. And there's a text. Actually, exhibition designer had a great idea. Clausewitz. I don't know if you know his text on war. You have to read it because every general in the United States is reading this book right now. Klaus is very, very clever. He said, like, all peace is just a deferment of war. All peace is just a strategy of the next war. It's brutal, it's horrifying, it's tragic, and yet it's brought us into the 20th century with so much death. Think about it, the Holocaust, 30 million people perished. So the staircase goes around that new form, which is oblique, has vertical vitrines throughout, emblematic. First exhibition actually is animals in the military. I knew about the lions of Judah and the Hannibal elephants, right? But do we ever think that the French in the 60s, 70s sent a cat into space? Laika, the dog, by the Russians? And do we even think that pigeons, dogs, anthrax, biological warfare? It's all about how humanity has employed nature for purposes of violence. So it's interesting to work in a museum that has this story to tell, particularly in this new wedge. And there's the old staircase. You look into it, you're back in the sort of period of Weimar or something. And you see the toys. Kids love to play with, toys, guns. And even the Alouette, another reference to nature, the French helicopter. They're exhibited in very interesting ways, not confirming one's idea of what these objects are, but really terrifying what we produce, what technology has produced. And of course, things that come from the air, what falls on the ground. It's a very minimalist exhibition, because in this wedge, in the armory you see the history. In this wedge, only questions are asked. The following: why do people follow authoritarian leaders? No answer given. Why do people march in order? Why do they carry guns and shoot on order? No one has ever given answers to these questions. Now, people tried, but no answers are given. But it's full of life. And by the way, as you ascend to the Dresden Blick, as they call it in German, the Dresden View, you see the cities bombed, the fragments of cities bombed from Dresden by the Air Force of Dresden. Wieliczka in Poland, Coventry in England, many cities destroyed from Dresden. So there's no sentimentality here. And then you leave the museum. I think that's the most radical part. You leave the museum on an upward slant into the wind. And you're in front of the museum. You're in this. You can see the reflection on the right. You can see the outdoor space on the left. And you're literally suspended on this metallic open framework. It's a little scary, but that's what I wanted at the end. It's just the individual is suspended in front of the military history, because it's a democracy. The military is not sitting behind the walls. The people are in front. And you get a view of the bombing site. You get a view, fantastic view of Frauenkirche and the downtown of the Baroque city. And you just get a sense that in a democracy, military should not be hidden. It should be exposed. And a visitor should himself or herself be suspended in that space, in front of the building, in front of all those items. Anyway, it's a building that has attracted many people, has changed. It's not anymore people like wars or like to see equipment. It's really an institution that makes one think about why is this the largest building in Germany? And this is not a building in Washington or in London or in Paris. It's in Germany. Very important. School. I wanted to show you a very modest building, because it's good to work on very modest projects in beautiful places. This is in Durham in UK. And it's a building, you see it here, that is basically, the budget was $8 million. It's not a lot of money, from A to Z, everything included. So not a lot. Build a 3-story building with offices, nothing more. Like 80 offices, and build a small building. So I didn't want to build, who wants to build a 3-story building with offices? It's not, how can you take something of the idea of fundamental physics? And my son is an astrophysicist. He told me a little bit about the logic of space, these amazing things that are. So I tried to draw this perfect cosmic, curve. And you can see it in this drawing, sort of trying to implode it all into a very, very modest small building, which is on a nice campus. Durham has that great cathedral. It's a concrete building, very sustainable, with wooden, large facades. And I created this form in order to use as much possible spaces where people informally can meet, scientists. So you can see each plan is completely different. I mean, it's not easy to do in a three-story building, each plan different. But I did succeed in doing a kind of a spiral with balconies, places to meet, outdoor spaces, and also the atrium, which is, you can see, you can look through it. They didn't have enough money for curtains. They have Chamberworks there, so you can look through. The light can come into the center of the building. And of course, there are offices, which each scientist has to have. And it's an elegant, small, interesting building. But yeah, it's something that I really enjoyed. Make something that is so limited. You know, what can you do? You know, the budget is for a 3-story office building. Even the atrium was pretty difficult to finance. But somehow it looks good. People like it. It's a building that sort of has a presence on campus, and at the end, you know, we are in the turmoil of the cosmic spaces. We are just like a little piece of dust in that space. Climate, that's a subject that everybody's interested in. Everybody knows that it's important. This is my French year. I won 3 competitions. I've never built anything in France. Italy, Germany, other places. I won a competition in Paris, this competition in Toulouse, and another competition in Nice. So here was the idea. The idea was, here's the ancient city of Toulouse. You know it. It's near the Pyrenees. Low city. Beautiful. It's called the Pink City. Actually, Louis Kahn says that it's his favorite city. This and Albi. The program was, in the railway intersections, produce a very fat building. Big, fat building. So I said to my clients, no, let's not do a fat building. Let's do the tallest possible building we can with this program. 165-meter building. But let's really relate it to it's on train tracks. The railway station is next to it. The Canal du Midi is running next to it. Let's create something really fantastic, not just some plans, but carve deep into the building and have cultural activities at the very top. There's hotels, there's offices, there's retail. But it's like a segment of a city, and it's the first step. And I also proposed how to cover the rest of the tracks, which divide the town. You can see that the town is divided. Most European towns are divided by the railway tracks. So here it is, a physical model. It's not easy to do this, to carve so deeply that you can use the green both inside and outside. It's not just a decorated facade. And also create something that has the dynamic and sense of this 19th century, 18th century city, where you can see that spiral really moving across the glazed facade and having a sense of place. And I was actually kind of surprised that I won this competition because everybody else had very conservative buildings. People, they already know the game, so they say, we know what's going to get built. But they didn't, because sometimes politicians, jurors have other ideas than architects think they have. So that's a building under construction. And I think it's going to be spectacular because the public spaces on the top, which are meeting rooms, there's a cafe, there's a restaurant, there's a lounge. You'll get the best view of the Pyrenees. I think no one will ever see the Pyrenees anywhere except in Toulouse. And my other project in France is here. Probably one of the most beautiful cities in the world, Nice, 19th century city. And the project called for the entire block next to the station. So I love these forms. I love these forms that collide, just like in my drawings, that explode, that are not kind of rationalized in any way. So here it is. You see the whole block. There's the 19th century railway station. On one side is a huge highway, and that's where you arrive. And it's the poorer part of town, but it's only 5 seconds from the richest part of town. So I said, why not create here something really very dramatic, very interesting, a building that has many, many programs, including auditorium for the public. It's not just private activities, restaurants. A building that brings you back to the station and to that highway overpass in a way that will change the nature of this city and create, I think, a very spectacular building, very spectacular place. You'll see it from the highway on the upper level, in speed. So it has to work, in different scales of speed. And again, a building that there were 5 other competitors. You probably know who they are because they were all French. And every one of them had arches. Arches. Building, it's like a station with arches. It's like arches. That's Vignola. So anyway, you never know what people really want, and it's under construction as well. Future, One of the greatest crimes, I said, was the Holocaust and the atomic bomb. But the other third greatest crime is the enslavement of Africa and of Africans. So I had a chance to work with a genius, Richard Leakey. He basically invented, he and his family, his father and mother, invented paleoanthropology in Kenya, discovering where do we come from? Where does our DNA come from? We all come from Kenya. We all come from Turkana, a particular desert today, not then, thousands of years ago. So he asked me to design a building with him for kind of the origins of who we are. Why do we come from Africa? When did pigment, when did pigment come into faces? Just so recent. We think there's black and white and green. It's all just nothing. There it is, Turkana, Salt Lake. It's a mystery. It's the most beautiful place in the world. It's 2 hours by plane from Nairobi. If you ever have a chance, you really will feel at home, because I didn't feel foreign. I didn't feel foreign, even though I don't speak Swahili. It feels, yeah, this is humanity. And Nature magazine, I mean, my son, Noam, who's a scientist, told me, if you appear once on Nature magazine, you're considered a genius. There were at least 20 covers of Nature magazine of the Leakeys. The Lucy skull, Turkana boy, the earliest tools. And I found something about the tools that inspired me, because I saw them, because they have the collection of tools right there. That's where they all come from, thousands of years ago. And one of the scientists from Oxford pointed at me and said, this was the greatest invention of mankind. I said, why? Because I always thought, okay, they've got a sharp point. I said, no. Because someone had to have an idea of a sharp point in their head in order to find a rock that they could hit with another rock to produce a sharp point. Wow. So there it is. there is it. It's a kind of place, of exhibitions, of pilgrimage in the middle of this desert. I want to show you this. This is a 24-hour clock. Imagine this is 24 hours. The Earth was formed 4.6 billion years ago. Big Bang 14 billion years ago. At 00 was the formation of the Earth, let's say, 4.6 billion. Meteorites went at 3 a.m., origin of life at 4 o'clock, oldest fossils at 5:36. 6 o'clock was iron formations. Single-celled algae were at near 3 o'clock. Sexual reproduction began at 6 p.m. Seaweed, 8:28. Jellyfish, 8:48. Land plants, 9:52. Dinosaurs at 10:56. We are less than 2 minutes from midnight. And think about evolution. And I thought about it a lot, because when I opened the fundamental physics building, Lord Rees, one of the greatest scientists in the world, the royal astronomer of the UK, said to me, Mr. Libeskind, we are now entering into the era of post-human. And I said, what? He says, yes, post-human. And he's an 80-year-old man, 85-year-old man. I said, what do you mean post-human? When? Thinking 300 years from now, 400 years from now. No. He said, within 60 years, we will be transformed. We will not be human. We will be post. So there it is. There is the sketches based on Africa, based on kind of discovering the spaces from inside of the tool, inside of that thought of the point, that something has to have a point in order to cut something else. And of course, it's about Africa. Africa is the continent of the future. And here are some sketches, because it's really in the works. Sketches of a variety of spaces, which don't have a lot of, it's desert environment, so it's not going to be air conditioning. It's going to be done in a very, very different way in order to be built. But again, the drama, maybe one dinosaur, maybe even a plastic dinosaur, who knows? Maybe they will not even have the original stones. But it's just a kind of place to come to and to kind of discover the amazing sense of what is the human? What is the human being? Where are we? And where are we going? Okay, let me end here, because I'm perhaps going too far. This is the most complicated project I ever worked on. And it's New York. And everybody knows where they were in 9/11, because that's the minute that the world changed. We know that the world changed. The world is different. We travel differently. We think differently of the news. We think differently of global politics, of nature. It's that day. And where was I? After so many years of working in the Jewish Museum, I was in Berlin. And I turned to Nina and some colleagues, and I said, what a great day for me, 9/11. The Jewish Museum is opening today at 7 o'clock in the evening. I don't have to think of Jewish history, because people can come to the museum and have their own experience. They can have their own experience about what it means. By 2:30, 2:38 p.m., Berlin time to be exact, then we saw the images of the destruction of World Trade Center and the Pentagon, the other flight. And the announcement was made, the Jewish Museum is not opening to the public. And it did not open for 3 days. And I remember that made a big impression on me. That you think that history is over, you think something is the past, but history is actually coming projected from the future. It's not coming from the back, it's coming at us from an unknown future. And I suddenly realized that all history is interconnected in very, very strange ways. So when I luckily, won the competition to be a master planner, and that's a story in itself, I drew this drawing. And these were my ideas. Statue of Liberty. There's got to be some sense of Statue of Liberty. 1776, Declaration of Independence, the human rights instrument, the first one ever. There's got to be the bedrock, with not just the bedrock with the footprints, but the bedrock where it happened. And the slurry wall on the right, there's got to be the foundations themselves to be revealed to the public. So that was kind of a sketch of my ideas. And also you can see, put the buildings as far away from the center. Don't build anything in the center. I was surprised that all the architects, and they're great architects, suggested building large-scale projects in the center of the project, because a piece of real estate. No one ever declared this to be anything but a piece of real estate, which has many stakeholders. Got the families of the victims, who are in the thousands, believe me, in the tens of thousands, sisters, brothers, uncles, aunts, cousins, in the tens of thousands of the 3,000 people from 90 different countries who perished. Port Authority owns the land, 7,000 engineers and architects. Just think about it. It's an organization of 7,000 engineers and architects directed by the governor of New York and New Jersey, two very powerful governors. Streets of New York are owned and organized by City of New York. Mayor of New York controls the streets, not the Port Authority. Path train authorities, their own, and subway authorities, their own authorities. So, you have to bring a consensus to a body that is, and of course, developers, private developers with their own architects who have their own agendas. How do you bring in a democracy? And I am a great believer in democracy. This complex group together. And I show you this not out of vanity. It's not out of vanity, but I want to show you that it's a project that has been, now less, in this almost every day in the news. And controversial, because people wanted to rebuild the two towers. Mayor Giuliani wanted to have just low buildings. We don't remember those things. Many people said, leave the site as it is. Don't do anything for the next 50 years, so that we are sure what it meant. But no, I was determined as a New Yorker that this site should come back to life, but in a different way, with public space at its center. And out of the 16 acres, it's a very small site, 16 acres, 8 acres in my plan, which you can see already today, is public space. That to me is the key. There's an early sketch, the latest rendering. You can see here also the Performing Arts Center, which is under construction, Tower number 2, which is coming. But we already have 1776, the first tower, Freedom Tower. We have Tower number 3, Tower number 4. We have the Visitor Center. We have the footprints, and we have the museum underground, which was also a big and important. I show you this as a diagram because it's pretty easy to design a building, but very hard to design foundations 75 feet below. You have to design all the foundations. The trains were running almost 2 days later after the attack, the trains, path trains, and subways were running because otherwise New York can't live. To create the infrastructure, to be able to really design foundations for buildings that may not even be happening in your lifetime. I learned something about why most city plans, master plans, wind up in museums. They're never built. There's also nice drawings, but the plan is never realized. So that's the idea. How to realize a plan, how to be practical. Don't make megastructures. Divide the plan into relatively regular buildings that can be implemented as the economy, as people want to build them. And by the way, you can see the transportation system, which is the key, actually, to the whole site. I was able to preserve the fragments of the disaster as well. I think it's important that the memory of the site be alive, of course, in the visitor center, and most importantly, the slurry wall. This is the foundation. I remember seeing this picture. I remember the ramp that was here. And I was in that room in a skyscraper next door with, you know, Norman Foster and Richard Meyer, all my friends, looking down on a dim November day. And somebody from the Port Authority said, does anybody want to go there? And everybody said, no. This is the best view we can possibly have of the site. She said, you look straight down at it, One Liberty Plaza. But I said, and Nina, we said, like, we want to go. And we got these cheap galoshes, the umbrellas, you know. And I tell you, my life changed as I touched that, you know, it's not a sentimental statement. It changed. I asked Nina, I called the office. It was still in Berlin. We've been working on, you know, planning, doing different things, buildings, right? She said, forget about it. Nothing to do with these buildings. It's about this place. It's about the spirit of this place. And it's about this wall. And it's a foundation. It still supports the site, you know, but it's very difficult to have a foundation exposed. Most foundations that we see are buried. You know, in Rome, broken foundations, in Jerusalem, in Athens. You can see a foundation when it's over. But to keep a foundation, because you need a load on top of the foundation to make the foundation work, right? You need a load, a heavy load. But if you have no load, if you want to show it, it takes a lot of engineering. It's very complex. But I had friends in the Port Authority who liked the idea. Show the wall, because that's the only thing that you see of the actual attack. That's what we saw, that we should have never seen, and we should never been at the bedrock level, because that's only where construction workers are. And by the way, on the other side of that wall, it's a dam. On the other side is the Hudson River. All the pressures of the Atlantic Ocean. If that wall had fallen, think about it, it would have been an apocalypse, because everything would have been flooded by the power of water. So that wall is strangely a testament to building in New York. And I was very pleased when Pope Francis came to New York, not long ago. He didn't speak in Central Park, where people thought he was going to be speaking in Central Park, or he's going to be speaking in 42nd Street, Times Square. He chose to speak at the wall. And I thought that was very moving, because he had all the leaders, you know, ecumenical leaders, religious leaders from across the world speaking. And I was very moved that the wall communicates something that words cannot really communicate, the solidarity of people across religion, across nations, across ideologies. It's about architecture. And of course, the footprints, beautiful design of Michael Arad. But I proposed the water in the competition, which was very, you know, there was a headline, front page of the Post. Libeskind is bringing Niagara Falls to New York. Ha, ha, ha. But, you know, it's good to bring water to New York, because it's a lot of hardscape, and you want to have a sense of nature, and also of the sound of water, which screens the very, very noisy streets of Manhattan. And I showed this, the slurry wall, and the fact that the footprints go all the way down to bedrock. I fought the most, I think, for that, because that space is so expensive. Everybody wants to be under that space, right? You don't need, they said you can make a memorial with the footprints, which is only this deep, only 2 meters. You don't need the depth. But I said you need the depth to orient people to the depth of New York, and also to the scale of the destruction, and to the center of public space. And of course, this is now really, we work and live there. It has millions of visitors, the most visited site in the United States by far. The museum too, one of many millions of people. But you can read the name, and that public space is open. And I think that's what I thought. I thought of my parents. I grew up, my parents were working in factories, in the sweatshops of New York, my mother and my father in the printing sweatshops. I said, what would they get from the site? They would never be in those beautiful buildings, because they're not going to be working for Condé Nast. They don't have, that's not them. Most New Yorkers are not going to be on those buildings. What do people get? They should get a sense of openness, a sense of the view towards the Hudson, a sense of a place that gives hope in the beauty of New York, which is beautiful, but also a testament to that day, the fateful day. So that's how I thought about it. There's, this space is really very active. It's needed badly in New York. And I actually went against Port Authority by suggesting another public space, because there's never enough public space. So I created what I call the wedge of light. It's a space defined by 8:46 a.m. When the first tower was struck, and 10:28 when the second tower collapsed. You can see it here. It's defined by the center of the PATH terminal, central skylight, And it's defined by the not yet existing edge, southern edge of tower number 2, which you see the foundation here. That's going to be a very dramatic space. And by the way, you see it here. You see it from looking towards Broadway, because there's a lot of people coming from Broadway. And on this September 11th, that whole skylight opened. It's amazing, actually. It just opened, and the light fell, because it was a sunny day, just exactly on that line. And I thought that's exactly right, that it's a memorial in the light. It's not a memorial with a sign. It's just the light of the place. And you can see it here. You can see that slight twist of the center of the path terminal. You see the buildings are standing in a grid, but they're also standing torqued towards a kind of circle, which I consider kind of the torch. And you can see how much space there is, given that we have 10 million square feet of office space. We have 5 million square feet of culture, 2 million square feet of infrastructure. The density of this site is the density of the whole of downtown of a major American city. Take all of Baltimore, all of Denver, it's here. But it doesn't look it. That was my intent. Public space, streets. People have access to be together. That's the key. And culture, which is available. And there is the rendering, how it will look. And look, it's pretty close already to being there. It'll still take time. Tower number 2, we don't know when. Performing Arts Center under construction, maybe 5 more years, maybe 7 more years, but it's there. And I end here where I started, because I was an immigrant from Poland to New York. And I had one of those visions, I was in a ship, one of the last immigrants to come by ship, because it was cheaper later to fly to Kennedy. And I did. My mother woke me up, asked, get up, you're going to see New York. My sister and I were standing on the deck of that ship, like in those movies. And it's unfathomable what you see. You see the skyline of New York, which is kind of something amazing, seen from the water. It's kind of an impossible dream, even if you've seen postcards or movies of New York. Just seeing it, what people can do in a democracy. And the Statue of Liberty, which I passed by. I had no idea Emma Lazarus wrote the words, "Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free." It is about democracy. It is about America. It's about liberty. It's about freedom. We live in a time of attractions to dictators, attractions to anti-democratic forces. This is something else. This is America as it really is. Thank you.